if a person were looking from the air above the scene that was unfolding in the grounds of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and asked to observe what was below, then that person would have looked upon thus. Within the night, black and dark, winds puffing their way intermittently around the castle and its grounds and moonlight shining through the clouds, to the observer a few things unfolding which would not ordinarily have been observed on a typical middle of a Saturday night. Outside the grounds of the school, two main groups, opposing factions, were beginning to assemble, past the Edgestones and out of the official jurisdiction of the headmaster of the aforementioned school. The first, cowled in black and wearing masks, stood huddled as a group, united and jubilant, the ghoulish apparition of the dark mark above their chosen meeting point, their presence marked by a green glow of light above, and the number might have been a score or so. This was the most important night for the Death Eaters, one for which they had planned for weeks to herald the glorious rebirth of their powerful master. The second were disparate and divided, arriving to the scene at different moments, operating outside of the perimeter of the Edgestones and moving into the places they had learned by heart over the course of the last month, and concealing themselves with a variety of charms and other less sophisticated means. As each of the second group arrived, communicated their presence to another using via pre-designated but secret methods until the head of the group was satisfied that each member of the Order of the Phoenix were all in their agreed places. It might have been, to the eye of the observer, that the people assembled below resembled the start of a game of chess, taking their places on the field of battle ready to fulfill their assigned roles until one or other side finally claimed victory. To that observer we must now indicate the fly in the ointment, the spoiler of the game, the errant child who is about to steal the Monopoly money and lose the top hat. Into view through the gates of the school came a figure, running down the slope and into the open, his head illuminated in the moonlight. Once or twice the figure stumbled as it made its way towards the former of the two groups, running relatively slowly as if greatly encumbered in his flight. And behind him, something else to point out to the observer to make them reconsider their certainty that the game in its previous guise can be rescued by using Game of Life money instead, and the candlestick from Cluedo. For, following the first figure streamed another, the twin, perhaps, of the first that had come, not so sprightly and stopping every so often to check on the movement and position of the first. And behind the second, another pair of twins, trying to keep up. 88,888,888. Cecilia could just about see the figure of Snape picked out in the moonlight probably 100 yards ahead of her, and she pushed on and on, following his trail. Behind her, the castle lay still, and ahead she could just make out the line of trees towards which it appeared that Snape was heading. The tight, sickly feeling began to rise in her stomach again, and Cecilia stopped, panting and trying to make the flowing waves of nausea pass before she continued, walking unevenly with her long, ungainly legs which held her far taller than she ever imagined she would be. Down the path that led past Hagrid's hut she hurried, up which the gamekeeper and teacher had carried Snape almost a month ago. Down further and over the basalt outcrop which supported the owlery. Down further and towards the Edgestones, the perimeter of the castle grounds before. Coming into her view was a sight that she had witnessed once before, but far clearer. Then it had been like a dream, with the Death Eaters as mere actors on a stage in vulgar costumes, or so it had seemed. Now it felt real. Very real. For before her now were 30 or so of them, followers of Voldemort, standing underneath the dark mark. So very close to her. And so very terrifying. Stumbling over the corner of a large granite rock, Cecilia let herself fall, landing roughly behind it. She bit her lip to stop her from calling out, and she crouched behind its smooth exterior, and she felt in her pocket to check that Harry's potion was still intact. It was. And with a huge sigh of relief she cast her now perfect visioned eyes in the direction of the Death Eaters, assembled ready to enact their plan. Where was Snape? Cecilia questioned silently, glancing round frantically to find him. He wouldn't be able to defend himself here, even if the potion were to work. But if she could detain him from getting to them before she did. From her vantage point behind the rock, Cecilia stared at the dark wizards. The masks they wore hid any trace of their identity, although from their frames and builds it was possible to determine which those were that she had seen before. Cecilia picked her way through the Death Eaters in her sight, searching frantically for Snape. And to her horror, there he was, walking boldly through the now mocking Death Eaters as a chicken through a skulk of foxes. Leaning further forward over the rock, Cecilia strained to hear what one of them was saying to him, and she was torn between discovery before Voldemort had arrived and gleaning important information. To her left was another rock, a little smaller than the first dot. If she could just make it to that one, she would be in an even better position. Cecilia raised her head further over the rock, hoping to make her move, when a collective roar of indignation grew from the group of Death Eaters, and at the mocking din she froze. "Did you not bring her to us before now, Snape?" The voice was cold but recognizable. It was the Death Eater that had tortured and killed another last October in almost exactly the same spot that they were in now, to which Cecilia had been an unwitting witness. Cecilia's mind struggled to put the name to the wizard as she surveyed the rest of the Death Eaters, but she didn't have to. She watched Snape stand to his full height, staring the wizard down. "I am answerable, as I have always been, only to the Dark Lord. It is for his pleasure only that I bring the glorious news at this magnificent hour, Lucius." Cecilia froze again. Lucius Malfoy, Draco's father. One of the most loyal dark wizards of Voldemort. Have information, then. As Cecilia strained to hear the rest of the conversation, a gust of wind blew over the surroundings, redirecting its amplitude away from her, and she could only watch now as another Death Eater stepped forward, more diminutive in stature, raising his wand to Snape. He raised his wand. "But your powers are removed," screamed Cecilia silently. "You can't retaliate. You took the potion that was meant for Harry. Your powers will have gone with the exception of one, and as your potion is different to Harry's, then it probably won't be Avada Kedavra." "Not at home, Snape." Cecilia leaned forward again, catching snippets of conversation. Another dot killed them all." Realizing that it was useless trying to understand what they were saying, Cecilia felt her knees begin to ache as she crouched behind the rock, and she realized it was because she was unused to Snape's legs, which were far longer than hers. Shifting position and ignoring the dull ache that was beginning to grow in her arms, and trying to forget the potent images of the Grimmauld Place kitchen and her close to fatal meeting with Sirius Black, Cecilia looked back at the group of Death Eaters. But the group was not now united, for, from what Cecilia could see, one of them was standing isolated from the group, who looked to be uneasy, and perhaps even shaking, and she wondered why this should be so on the night of Voldemort's return. The lack of conversation in the group did not stop Cecilia from determining that this Death Eater was not popular with the rest of the group, for the smaller of the Death Eaters who had turned his attention from Snape to this Death Eater, moving purposefully from the main group and holding his wand in his direction. The two seemed to be arguing, both the small-built Death Eater and the loner. Many of the other Death Eaters had turned upon him now, and the rumble of noise began to fill the air as the wind turned again, the voices indistinct and affronted. "On the night like tonight we do not need to fight." Now a third Death Eater, as cowled and masked as any of them, moved himself to the center of the group, addressing all of them appeasingly. The group turned to him, and the wizard whom Snape had addressed as Malfoy pointed his wand in his direction, stiffening visibly. "Easy for you to declare such sentiments, Wormtail, when you're placed next to the Dark Lord's side as assured." Wormtail, thought Cecilia, shuffling round to the Death Eater that Lucius Malfoy had pointed at with his wand. Peter Pettigrew, Harry's father's other friend at school and the fourth marauder. Waiting for his master's return. A flush of anger pricked her skin as she thought of the injustice he had caused Harry to suffer at his actions. Which was replaced by the calming swell of equanimity. She would soon be in a position to end all of this. Very soon. And now, as a chill wind passed over the scene as the Death Eater's conversation diminished and Cecilia crept round to the right-hand side of the rock to gain a better view. The Dark Lord will be with us shortly and we will be able to storm the castle and kill the Mulborn wizards, she heard Malfoy declare. He was standing at the center of the group now and was staring at Snape, and now, from this new viewpoint, Cecilia could hear everything that was being said. If you do not wish your mole woman to be murdered along the way, Snape, I should fetch her for us now. Snape returned Malfoy's glare, their distrust mutual. I do not need to prove my loyalty to you, Malfoy. My word is good enough for the Dark Lord. At his word, the diminutive Death Eater spoke, and Cecilia gasped when she realized it was the same one who had caused Snape to suffer all those weeks ago with Malfoy under the Cruciatus curse. No, her mind raced. I'll stand before you and suffer before you torture him again. Why was she not at her home, Snape, when you had arranged with us that she would be? Our advantage would have been secure if you had managed to do this one simple thing. Listening carefully, Cecilia pieced together the information that she was hearing, trying not to gasp at the realization. He had saved her from their visit to her home. When he had come to take her urgently to Hogwarts at Christmas. Again, my explanation is satisfactory for the Dark Lord. Are you suggesting that you are better than he, that you require me to repeat it? He addressed the female Death Eater now, whose wand was also raised in Snape's direction, and in return, he held his own wand aloft again. Expelliarmus! Declared Snape, pointing his wand at their woman Death Eater. To her surprise, as to the others around them, the only thing that happened was a small wisp of smoke that emanated from the tip of his wand. And then, Cecilia closed her eyes when they drove Snape to his knees under the Cruciatus curse. No. She could not bear it. She wanted to scream with all the effort she had in her lungs that it should be her enduring it, not him. He should not be the suffering again for her. She began to rise. Using Snape's legs. She would face them. The wind changed, taking away the conversation from Cecilia. Instead of striding out to meet them as she had intended, she peered around the rock again, the potion clutched in her hand through the pocket of her robe. She could not help him if Voldemort wasn't if it wasn't he at whom she could throw this potion at the right moment. The moment he cast the Avada Kedavra curse. Jamming Snape's large hands over his ears through his lank hair, she shrank back against the rock, feeling his heart hammer against his chest. It was all set up, but no matter. No matter. Lucius Malfoy's silky voice cut smoothly through Snape's agonizing screams. I will suggest how the matter can be resolved this very night, Bella. Malfoy turned and addressed his sister-in-law. Enough. On a night such as this it should be screams of moles we hear. Ignoring Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange raised her wand again, but this time Malfoy raised his, waving it in such a way that made her withdraw. Bella, stop it now, he added. How will the Dark Lord ever command the loyalty of others if you do not follow instructions? Malfoy smirked as he watched his sister-in-law flinch, taking a step back. When he saw two other Death Eaters take a step towards him, however, he turned to Snape, who was slumped on the ground. Cecilia peered round the rock again and, as a month ago, there was Snape, a hunched figure recovering from the agony of their torture. She is in the castle and she can tell us what we need to know. Malfoy's voice was cold and demanding, and he pointed his finger in Cecilia's direction. She ducked out of earshot behind the rock. That had been close. No, Snape muttered, his voice punctuated with pain. She is at her home. He is lying. Wormtail shouted, glowering at Snape. She is in the castle. He is protecting her. Cecilia watched as the conversation between them lapsed into windless silence, and now Malfoy was stood over Snape with what appeared to be a vial of potion. Mercilessly he pulled back Snape's head by the hair, pouring its contents into his open mouth. Cecilia gasped as he leaned forward in an attempt not to choke on the contents. "Do you recognize it, Snape?" whispered Lucius Malfoy, in triumph, a smile playing on his lips. "Veritaserum," growled Snape, looking at him with unalloyed detestation. Malfoy smirked horribly. "From your own batch, you'll be delighted to know. Unfoolable. Perfect truth in a bottle." He turned to the other Death Eaters declaring, "Now we will have the truth that Snape so desperately wants to keep to himself." Beside Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange and Peter Pettigrew also grinned. The answers that they so badly required, whose concealment had caused their suffering, would now be evident for all to hear. "Where is the mole known as Cecilia Frobisher?" Pettigrew stepped forward, his porcine eyes staring at Snape. "At the castle," he said at once. "What plan is to be put into place this evening?" Malfoy bent his knees, lowering himself to Snape's level. "The Order will attack once the weapon is used." Snape coughed painfully, placing a hand on the ground to steady himself. "So," declared Bellatrix, her eyes glowing in triumph as her eyes raked the green-tinged semi-darkness. "The weapon is here, somewhere. But it is not complete. It will fail the one that uses it," continued Snape, getting painfully to his feet. "What are they saying?" thought Cecilia, as she watched the Death Eaters begin to crowd round Snape, wands raised. As Malfoy and Bellatrix raised their wands, Cecilia found herself hiding her head in her hands, unable to witness Snape's torture again. But when the blinding white-blue light she was expecting from the Cruciatus Curse did not come, Cecilia looked towards the group again. This time, Snape was on the floor, apparently punched in the stomach by one of the larger Death Eaters behind Pettigrew. The Death Eater rounded again, kicking Snape, and Cecilia gritted her teeth at the awful sickening sound. "He can't fight back," she screamed silently to the world. "He has no powers." And then, when she thought she could bear no more, a sickening crunch punctured the night as the air whipped towards her, which sounded like Snape's arm breaking. Cecilia craned her head forward, trying to catch the conversation that Malfoy was having with Snape, who was slumped again on the ground. Pockets of words she could make out, and she held her breath to make sure she could catch as much as possible. And so, she heard Malfoy say, "Then when the Dark Lord returns he will be very happy that you have brought her to us." Agonizingly, Snape got to his feet. "He will not bring her," declared Pettigrew, stepping towards Snape. "He comes. And you have no prize for him. The prize. The mole. With the secrets. With the book. You should have brought her here. To tell the secrets." Pettigrew's eyes began to glow with fury, his feared loyalty to his master causing him to turn his anxieties on Snape. "Calm yourself, Wormtail," said Malfoy, his voice light and mocking. "He will bring her, for he knows that we will kill her when we attack the castle." He turned his head and looked scathingly at Snape. "He knows he will not get his heart's desire if he does not bring her to our Lord." Without waiting another second, Snape recovered his balance, staggering under what he had endured, his face a mask of derision. The Death Eaters surrounding him took a step back as he cast them his look before staggering from them and across the grass. Cecilia watched him head towards the castle, as the clouds sailed across the icy moon that hung over the castle, its light clashing violently with that of the Dark Mark. She could see that Snape was making slow progress, and she made to get to her feet. This time she could help him. This time he would not suffer on her account as he had done the last time. Inching back from the rock, Cecilia got to a crouching position, ready to go after him. As she watched him climb the rocky scarp that led up to the castle, she began to plot her next course of action. Get him to Poppy. Get him well. Return to the group. In the limelight, Snape stumbled and Cecilia winced, diverting her planning. Yes. She could pretend she was him and that she, Cecilia, wasn't in the castle. This should infuriate them enough to get their master. And when Voldemort arrived, Cecilia gripped Harry's potion inside her robe again and rose to a half-crouch, ready to run after him. A brilliant light behind her made her stop, and a wind as cold as ice swept out from a point that was behind her. Around her, the trees that were in view appeared to bend outwards, their branches bowing as if reaching long spindly fingers towards the castle. Cecilia crouched back down against the rock as the ebb of the wave rushed back towards her, the wind hitting her full in the face, flattening her against the granite rock. When it had subsided, Cecilia inched her way around it, and looked back at the group of Death Eaters. Who were no longer a group. In the clearing they stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, their bodies stiff as if standing to attention. The light that had radiated out from behind her appeared to have concentrated in the center of the group, its brilliance concealing what was within. As Cecilia watched, the cold glow began to fade and the night air be pulled in the direction of the epicenter. The form of a man began to materialize where the glow diminished. Cecilia watched as the alert Death Eaters, as one, fell to their knees, surrounding the man subserviently as the sickening green light of the dark mark crowned him above. Realization flooded her face and she began to peer further round the rock again, all thoughts of helping Snape now abandoned as she looked upon the form of Lord Voldemort, reborn, and more terrifying than Cecilia could ever imagine. One of the Death Eaters got to his feet and Voldemort turned to look at him. To Cecilia his face seemed expressionless, although he appeared to be conveying some honor on the Death Eater, for, as he bowed, Voldemort extended an arm, placing it on the crown of his head. "My lord, this is indeed an honor." The man addressed Voldemort before turning in apparent self-satisfaction and looking at the rest, before returning to his kneeling position on the ground. Then Voldemort produced what looked in his large hands to be a small book that the man had given to him, displaying it in an arc to his followers, who looked at one another and nodded approvingly. Now as Cecilia looked, the Death Eaters were rising, in ones and twos, as if the formality of their master's arrival was over and they were free to be more casual, and their chattering became more of a dull roar. From the crowd now, one of the Death Eaters approached Voldemort and appeared to whisper something to him, and now, as Cecilia watched, Voldemort's expression twisted into one of obscene delight. The rest of the Death Eaters stopped their talking and looked in his direction as Voldemort spoke. "Snape does not concern us now, Wormtail. He has already brought her 88,888,888. And now on the field of battle, adding to that mix of figures that initially upset the setup of the game, are some with rules of their own that they are ready to exact to their own advantage." In Draco Malfoy's hand, as he swept through the arch of the school courtyard, was a book. Holding it tightly lest the wind that he had felt sweep across the landscape take it from his thin bony fingers, he hurried through the arch and around the corner, throwing himself against the sandstone walls of the castle's outer fortification. Elizabeth Mitchell, he thought, glancing from side to side and checking that the coast was clear before allowing himself an indulgent smirk. Now that he thought about it, didn't that just about make absolute sense? No squib would ever admit it to anyone, let alone Snape, and, much as he looked up to his head of house, he could not believe that a wizard, the Mole, he corrected himself, would admit this to him. Leafing through the pages, he considered the irreparable damage that he had caused in the Mole Studies classroom. The potions that were at the back he had thrown into the drain, and the animals in cages he had let free. The notebooks that were on the desk would have made rich fuel for the classroom fire had he not spied this damning volume. Magic and Moles. The woman was a mole then, not a squib. Her name was Cecilia Frobisher, and not Elizabeth Mitchell. As he leafed through the book again, his chest began to fill with outraged indignation. He had been the cause of sending his father false information, resulting in a brief and disparaging letter written in the third person, and how he hoped Draco would never meet his incompetent son. Disregarding his father's stinging and bitter words, Draco took furtive glances to his left and right again before hurrying across the grounds of Hogwarts. His pace began to quicken as he rewrote in his mind his father's letter, now full of praise in light of the news that he was about to impart. Nervous excitement began to occupy his thoughts too, for at last he would meet the Dark Lord, Lord Voldemort, from whom his father had forbidden Draco to attend, according to his mother's wishes. Images of himself walking into Voldemort's inner circle with the news filled Draco's mind, and he clutched magic and moles ever closer as he hurried quicker towards the owlery. The Dark Lord, in Draco's mind, would honor Lucius Malfoy's son as he brought him vital news on the day of his triumphant return to power. His father would be honored in his stead and his former errors forgotten. The light from the Forbidden Forest cascaded over the landscape half a mile away, and Draco fixed his mind on the goal. Crossing to the perimeter of the school grounds, tripping every so often over the uneven earth towards the green glow of the dark mark. Filling his mind with imagined exaltation. Hurrying impatiently to where he knew his father would now be waiting. 88,888,888. Cecilia pressed her back against the cold granite rock and held her breath. Voldemort, the most powerful dark wizard, reborn and terrible, was not just talking to her. He was addressing her. His voice cut through the night as lemon juice through grease, splitting it with acidic coarseness, and an unbidden chill passed through her, Snape's, body. Mrs. Frobisher, we know you're the. I can hear your mind. I can hear your thoughts. Cecilia gazed up at the moon, its light illuminating Snape's face as if she were in the spotlight. She could imagine a scene behind her, the Death Eaters upon whom she had been spying staring at her, their hands gripping wands. Mrs. Frobisher. Voldemort was addressing the environment at large now, casting his gaze hither and thither. You believe Severus Snape is your defender. And yet you are here, within. He paused, his head shifting around as if other senses than the usual five were attuning themselves. 100 feet of us. At his words, the Death Eaters, who were clumped together in twos and threes, began to survey the grounds, wands aloft as if intending to search within this radius and curse anything that moved. Voldemort, however, held up his hands, looking at them as if they were children. No. My dearest colleagues. He glanced amongst them as if they were errant sheep in his fold. Patience, she will be ours in due course. Glancing up from the Death Eaters, Voldemort began to look round, addressing the environment again. It is so unfair, Severus, he declared to the now absent Snape, that you have been keeping her to yourself. I do wonder whether, after tonight, she was worth it. Jerking his head to another part of the clearing, he continued to speak again. And Dumbledore. How myopic of you, blind to the stupidity of the mole race. Investing time and effort into a weapon that will not actually work. Cecilia sank lower before her lunar spotlight, into a hunched ball, holding her hands before her ears again as Voldemort's mocking laughter reverberated around the night. As it trailed off, a good few minutes later, she wondered whether the imploding silence that remained wasn't more frightening. And now Dumbledore, continued Voldemort, shouting around him as the Death Eaters bowed their heads in deference, you must watch as she brings you all down with her. Come out and cast your mole spells. Come out, Cecilia Jane Wells. Cecilia's mind was jerked into action at the use of her name, and she interlocked her fingers tightly. I know all about you. And your husband. It is best, don't you find, to keep your enemies close to hand? This time, Cecilia was sure that his voice was entering her head without the tedium of being turned into sound and passing through her ears, and she felt her body stiffen as an icy cold shock, like a surprise after wave, penetrated her body. Close down your mind, she told herself. Disregard your feelings. Your ideas. Let them go. Go. Where is she, my lord? Let me bring her to you. Wormtail bobbed excitedly around Voldemort, like a dog eager to prove its loyalty to its master. I will make her tell you what you need to know. he added lasciviously. Many other of the Death Eaters, awoken from Voldemort's hypnotic speech by Pettigrew's voice, looked at him with loathing. She is not here. I cannot sense her anymore. Voldemort looked around at his followers and broke into what could only be described as a smile. We have a busy night ahead of us, however, and this mole will see to us that the true meaning of mole baiting is not forgotten. The Death Eaters exchanged contented smiles. At last, their master was to reveal to them the exact nature of his plan, and their role in it. That moles were to die was news that many of them relished. But before I reveal my plan, he continued, glancing around into the distance again, can we not entice you, mole, to show yourself? Even now you may find that Lord Voldemort may spare your life in exchange for information. Cecilia looked at the castle now where, with her conscience separated from her mind, she could just about make out a figure being helped to his feet by two others. For you cannot even hope to win this battle. Your only salvation, Cecilia Frobisher, is that I, as a merciful lord, hear your pleas for mercy. Breaking off his address to the distance, Voldemort suddenly returned his attention back to his Death Eaters who were staring at him expectantly. My loyal Death Eaters, Voldemort continued, his tone changing to commanding affection, my faithful followers. You have waited in the shadows, carrying out my duty as I instructed. You have suffered. He glanced at Bellatrix, who dropped her head. You have been insulted. He glanced to Nott. You have had to masquerade as mole lovers. Tonight you will have your revenge for every insult that has been inflicted on the name of wizard. Tonight every person in this land will know the name of Lord Voldemort. 88,888,888. Mrs. Frobisher. Fred looked at George urgently as Snape staggered past the Edgestones, and slumped on the ground in front of them. His hair was matted with mud and blood, and he was lying to his left, his right arm held limply. Get! Snarled Snape, his voice broken, and he slumped further forward still. Exchanging looks, George motioned to his brother to grab Snape's legs while he lay Snape back into his arms, holding him underneath the armpits. It's going to be all right, Mrs. Frobisher, began George, looking pitifully at Snape's face. You were so brave out there, continued Fred, lifting Snape up the knees as George lifted his torso. I can't believe you faced 30 Death Eaters on your own. And suffered the torture curse, exclaimed George, looking over Snape's now unconscious body. She's stopped breathing, George, exclaimed Fred urgently. What are we going to do? We've got to get her to Madame Pomfrey, declared George, beginning to walk Snape towards the archway that led to the courtyard. There's nothing we can do with her, she's so fragile, he added, looking at Snape's large frame. Yeah, agreed Fred, puffing under the weight of Snape's body. 88,888,888. Yet there is one amongst us who has not shown us the true way. My return would have been hastened at Christmas time if it hadn't been for the one amongst us who is the true traitor. Like a shoal of fish parting from danger, the Death Eaters broke apart, leaving Oswald T. Avery Jr. standing before Lord Voldemort. Intelligent like his father, though deeply cowardly, he demonstrated this latter quality by falling onto his knees. Yes, it is you, Avery, with whom I am most displeased. He held aloft the book that the first Death Eater had handed to him. This is the lock for which the key. The information you swore to retrieve of your father *S. is intended. You have failed. The lone Death Eater fell to his knees before lying prostrate in front of his master. This is just one of the 3 so-called unforgivable curses, Mrs. Frobisher, continued Voldemort above Avery's screams. Her back to the granite, still staring ahead, Cecilia's consciousness couldn't help but be stirred into action by the terrible moaning and screaming that this Death Eater was making as he suffered under the Cruciatus curse. Ignoring her waning willpower, Cecilia turned and peered around the rock again at the scene that she had witnessed almost half an hour ago where Snape had been. "Do you know who this is, Mrs. Frobisher?" continued Voldemort, addressing her indirectly again. "This is the son of the man who fed me information about the last reciprocator. This is Oswald T. Avery's son. You know him, Mrs. Frobisher, don't you?" Avery's screams began to subside as the blue-white lightning faded. She saw Voldemort lower his wand, only to raise it again. Another, very useful in its way, the imperious curse. "I can have Avery do whatever I want." Before the crowd of Death Eaters, Avery stood like a badly strung marionette, his back hunched and his shoulders drooped. Without warning, his arms began to flail, and he began to dance rapidly on the spot. Another flick of his wand caused Avery to approach another Death Eater and beg him for information, clearly amusing the other Death Eaters immensely. Once Avery had performed another jig, Voldemort lowered his wand and Avery slumped to the ground again, panting. And now the third. The killing curse. Her mind was open now. Like the front door of a mansion before stealthy thieves. Cecilia couldn't stop it whirring into action from its absent stupor. Wrenching herself back to the icy surface of the rock, she put her head in her hands trying to re-encase the images that she had seen in Tunks's photographs, and an inner conflict began as part of her fought her instinct to protest at the murder of the Death Eater Avery. 88,888,888. "Where is he?" asked Arthur Weasley impatiently. He turned to Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was in a group near the outskirts of the Forbidden Forest, and rubbed his hands together as a chill passed by them. Kingsley gave his hands a quick glance as multicolored sparks were generated before looking at him kindly. "Where's Molly this evening, Arthur?" he asked conversationally, and Mr. Weasley smiled at his colleague weakly. "At headquarters," he replied. "I wanted her to be as safe possible. Not that the Burrow's not safe enough, but—" he paused, a view of Avery being tortured by Voldemort catching his eye now. He winced. "She is needed for morale, of course," added Kingsley, wisely. "When we get through this, those of us that survive will be in urgent need of tea." He nodded understandingly in Mr. Weasley's direction, and Arthur nodded slowly. "Everything seems to be on track so far," continued Arthur, watching Avery perform a good impression of a puppet. "I just wish I could hear what they were saying." Arthur shifted from foot to foot anxiously. "I think the occlumency charm that Dumbledore put on us all would be broken if we get too near, Arthur," he said, watching Arthur, like a coiled spring next to him, clearly concerned about that evening's impending operation. "Not until the signal, when Snape returns," he added pointedly. "Yes, you're right," replied Arthur, sighing deeply, not taking his eyes off the scene before them. "Well, he's gone, but he should be back by now." Kingsley Shacklebolt nodded, joining him in looking where Tunks, from the group 10 yards away, was pointing. 88,888,888. Cecilia watched as the man appeared from the coiling smoke from Voldemort's wand. The man, perhaps in his early 30s, had a trickle of blood down the side of his face. He stood, facing Voldemort before turning to face the Death Eaters, his face a picture of terrified concern. She knew that face. She recognized him. He was the man from the picture. From Tunks's picture. Suddenly, one of the wizards pulls out wand, and the man's face contorted into confusion as one of the Death Eaters, the one who had stood behind the diminutive Death Eater and had broken Snape's arm, stepped forward, wand aloft. But this couldn't be happening. The man. He died in August. They'd killed his daughter too. The Death Eater extended his arm and the man began to levitate, a clear 2 feet off the ground. From his face, Cecilia could tell panic was beginning to arise in him. She turned quickly, forcing her back against the rock again. As she did so, she heard the Death Eater begin to laugh, and she looked ahead into the distance, at Hogwarts Castle. As quickly as he had leviated the poor man, Cecilia heard the Death Eater utter 2 words and a flash of green light exploded behind her. It isn't real, she told herself sharply, remaining rigid by the rock. Then her mind began an inner battle between morality and common sense. How can you sit there? The man is already dead. They can't kill him again. But it seems real. Interrupting her thoughts rudely, Voldemort's voice rang out cold and icy. George Hudson would like to thank Cecilia Frobisher for her assistance tonight. A woman's triumphant laugh pierced the night. His daughter would like to ask you why you did not save her father when you knew you could. Switch off the thoughts, Cecilia told herself, staring ahead. And now, for your entertainment. Severus Snape. Cecilia whipped her head back round in surprise, scanning the group for a sign, any sign of Snape having returned. Ah, Mrs. Frobisher, you are back with us, declared Voldemort to the open trees. Around him still stood the Death Eaters, again arranged in a circle around their lord, listening to him. So cowardly, to close one's mind to reality. So like your species. Unable to watch a simple execution, dear me. He shook his head in mock disappointment and, above the tenseness in her stomach, the overtones of bitter hatred. She was scared. But not of what she was about to do. When the time was right. When I am returned to my exalted station, then every mole in our path on will suffer this fate. Cecilia saw him look round at the faces of his followers again. Moles, Moleborns, Squibs. All will die as we purify our race. Do you wish to see our latest Mole exterminations? He addressed the Death Eaters before him and they nodded in eager anticipation. And I am sure Cecilia Frobisher would also like the pleasure. This time, the words appeared in her mind again. Stay focused. Watch the proceedings. Mrs. Frobisher. We know you are there. And Cecilia could feel her mind lurch, as if it was being prodded. Voldemort, she guessed, thinking her thoughts. Do not think. Keep your mind clear. Cecilia continued to watch Voldemort as he extended his wand as if it was an orchestral baton. Then before her eyes she witnessed the following acts of murder. Libby, her best friend, murdered by the Avada Kedavra curse by a slight, middle-aged witch with wild eyes. Derek, Libby's husband, tortured by a burly wizard with the Cruciatus curse before meeting the same end as Libby by the same means. Tim, her beloved Tim, losing his footing as he scaled Scawfell Pike, almost at the top. The scene panning out to show a Rodentine-featured wizard causing a rock to disappear right under his foot. Cecilia watched numbly from her vantage point as all 3 deaths grew and faded before her eyes. Her mind still empty, she forced the words into her mind that these were fake images, lies to try to lure her out. Then she added another few words. It isn't going to work. From the noise on the ground Cecilia realized the Death Eaters were now talking amongst themselves and, from her trance-like state she shook her head, scanning the scene again. Where are the Order, she thought to herself wildly. Why haven't they gone yet? I really hope that you enjoyed the show, Mrs. Frobisher. It's a pity ones so close have to suffer. And now, Voldemort, his wand still raised, addressed the environs again. We save the most lucrative mole killing for last. Really, Dumbledore, this young female mole did not need to die. In the center of the circle of Death Eaters again Voldemort flicked his wand and before him 2 figures appeared. This time, they faced one another and as the mist faded Cecilia could just make out that one was female. The Death Eaters fell silent as the wizard who stood opposite the woman took a step towards her, arm raised in angry gesticulation. Unlike the supposed deaths of her friends and family, there was dialogue between these 2 people which echoed around the clearing. Sirius Black's furious remonstrations caused Henrietta to take a step back and she crouched a little as if she thought he was going to hit her. Then Henrietta put her hands on her hips and shouted at him back, telling him that he was as bad as his family. As Henrietta began to walk away, Sirius called after her that she was ... Miss Bourne. Behind the rock, Cecilia recoiled as the events of Christmas fleeted through her mind. But it wasn't true. How could it be true? Forcing herself to look again, she saw Sirius, in different clothing, standing over the kneeling form of Henrietta. Raising his wand, he speaks the killing curse, and within a split second, Henrietta was slumped, lifeless. The scene faded and Cecilia continued to stare at the vacant space before Voldemort's wand. It sounded so real. But it couldn't be. Sirius hadn't killed Henrietta. How did she know? How does she know that Sirius wasn't a reformed Death Eater like Snape? But she had seen his arms, hadn't she? There was no dark mark upon them. Why aren't the Order here? The down-to-earth part of Cecilia's mind whirred into action now. What is the signal that they need? She is no longer here, said Voldemort, addressing the Death Eaters. The images of us exterminating her kind would have had her sobbing for mercy. They weren't real, she told herself sharply. These things are designed to lure her out. Then perhaps we are wasting our time, my lord. Malfoy stepped forward, gesturing towards the book in Voldemort's hands. Mysterious mythology will remain rather mysterious if we no longer have the Mole to interpret it for us. Silence. Voldemort's order drove Lucius Malfoy back to his place in the circle. Avery may still yet be of some use to us, however I still seek the interpretation. Mysterious mythology, thought Cecilia, aghast. Surely not her copy. That would mean Freya too. Shrinking back against the rock again, Cecilia screwed up her eyes in frustration. She could not tell now what was real, and what was not. Working logically was flawed, for if she trusted that Sirius Black killed Henrietta, she also had to trust that her husband's death was no mere accident and the entire of her friend's family were dead. Whereas on the other hand, that's the point, she told herself, closing her hand around the bottle of potion. None of it is real. None of it is supposed to make sense. Except for what she had in her hand. That was real. That made sense. They may or may not have done this to, and if she did not now declare this over, really they would do this to others. To people like her. People like Libby and Derek. From behind the rock Snape's legs stood her tall. Her stomach was as if she had eaten whole ice cubes as she was illuminated by the light of the moon, like a spotlight behind her, and she looked upon the greatest assembly of dark wizards that had probably ever assembled. Slowly Cecilia walked towards them, her heart now, down the rocky bank slowly, with her head held high. Never had she felt so scared, and as she walked amongst the Death Eaters her mind drifted to the length of time she had left in Snape's form from the Polyjuice potion which Hermione had made. Severus. Back so soon? Whispered one Death Eater mockingly. Cecilia thought as veiled faces shielded with bone masks and bodies covered with hooded robes stepped aside so that she could pass in the direction of Voldemort. Numel, I see, added another. As they swept past her, Cecilia wondered why she didn't feel half as scared as she should be. But then, she thought as they stepped back, with so concentrated a recipe that she had instructed her to use, this would probably kill her before any spell would. Clutching the potion inside her fist now, the last of the Death Eaters stood aside as she made her way to the center of them. Her aim would have to be true, she told herself, and just at the right moment. Cecilia lifted her gaze as Voldemort, his features glowing luridly under the green glow above him, addressed her, his voice like ice, rubbing at her bones as if she was standing in the Arctic blizzard. Ah, Mrs. Frobisher. We meet at last. 88,888,888. What the hell is he doing? Said Kingsley Shacklebolt to Tonks, who had crossed from her group at Mr. Weasley's behest. Was that Sirius we just saw down there? Looked a lot like him, muttered Arthur Weasley, staring at the Death Eaters and at Voldemort, who had opened his mouth to speak to them again. Sirius and a girl, pressed Kingsley, insisting an answer from Tonks. She shook her purple head in disagreement. He's in position, just like the rest of us, she added, looking curiously at Arthur Weasley. What was it you wanted, Arthur? He wanted to check the children were all right, said Sturgis, the third member of the group. Are they? He added. Tonks nodded. Minerva sent down an owl. Nothing untoward seems to have taken place at the castle. The students ushered back to their dormitories. She looked at Arthur as she spoke and he nodded absently. Come on, Snape, he whispered, almost to himself. Tonks looked at Kingsley, who mouthed the word, worried to her. She nodded in understanding. When are we changing positions? Asked Tonks, addressing Sturgis. Got to be sometime soon, hasn't it? 15 minutes, he confirmed, nodding at Kingsley, who also nodded. What are they playing at? Arthur added, and the three wizards looked at him and then past him. What's Snape playing at? Exclaimed Tonks, pointing towards the Death Eaters who were parting like a wave, allowing the form of Severus Snape to pass between them. The four wizards watched in fascination as Snape stood before Voldemort, looking at the wizard wordlessly. He was supposed to give the signal by now, fretted Arthur Weasley, wringing his hands in anxiety. Why is he just standing there? He turned questioningly to Kingsley, who shook his head. What is the signal? Whispered Tonks to Sturgis Podmore. The aged wizard scratched his balding head, giving Tonks a worried look. We'll know when he gives it, he whispered back. That was Dumbledore's final word on the subject. 88,888,888. Voldemort, intoned Cecilia in Snape's voice. She stood before the wizard, her heart beating slower and more intensely in her chest as Snape's dark eyes met the dark red coals that were his eyes. Indeed we do. And I would like to say that it is a pleasure meeting so famous a wizard as you. I have heard so much about you. Around her, the murmuring of the Death Eaters, clearly shocked that their lord was speaking in such a manner to Snape who, some were realizing, was in fact not Snape. And yourself, replied Voldemort, his voice not unpleasant as he scanned her up and down. Severus speaks highly of you, I must say. And you've come in disguise too. Such bravery. He glanced around at his followers, indicating to them his mockery. Such foolishness? Cecilia stared back at Voldemort. I am foolish, she agreed. And in disguise. Gripping the potion tighter in her hand, she tilted her chin higher and holding her head aloft, ignoring the glares from the surrounded Death Eaters, she nodded. This is stupid, negotiating with a mole. One of the Death Eaters, the one of diminutive stature who had tortured Snape earlier that evening, stepped forward and addressed Voldemort. She is nothing. Do away with her, my lord. Looking away from Cecilia, Voldemort shot Bellatrix Lestrange a warning glance and she lowered her wand that she had held up in Cecilia's direction. Silence Bella, she prefers to play it this way. He looked back at Cecilia, who was still staring fixedly at him. She likes to be treated like an equal, so I hear. A murmur began to rise amongst the Death Eaters and Voldemort looked at them, holding his arms out to signify he wanted silence. In one hand held aloft the book that he had been given by the glorified Death Eater, the same one he had thrust in the face of Avery. Cecilia said nothing, but transferred her gaze from Voldemort to the green cover. In the green light she could just make out the words on the cover, which did indeed read, Mysterious Mythology. It's an act, nothing more. Freya has the book safe. She is safe. You recognize the book. It wasn't a question. Cecilia held her breath, refusing to acknowledge the question. The book? He demanded frostily, thrusting it open in front of her. Cecilia scanned the page before her. It was the book. It was the book. The words energy like magic bordered the title page of Mysterious Mythology, and in the corner was the ink dot that Cecilia had got herself so worked up when she had caught her quill pen on it a week after joining Dumbledore. But Freya had it, didn't she? Where were the order? She stared back at the page, knowing that her growing panic would show on her face. Voldemort stared at Snape's head, snorting scornfully in her direction. We discovered the identity of the bookkeeper 50 years ago, the secrets kept by every reciprocator written into the text, but by the time Avery Sr. had organized the Goblin riots it was too late. Cecilia looked from the book back to Voldemort, watching him lick his lips as he considered her predatorily. Fenrir Greyback was able, at least, to give John Lupin's son something to remember him by. Cecilia stopped. Fenrir Greyback. Where had she heard the name before? The werewolf. Voldemort gestured in the direction of the Death Eater who had handed him the book when he first materialized before the Death Eaters. Didn't you know, Mull? Persuasive nature, werewolves. In horror, Cecilia turned round to where Voldemort was gesturing and her mouth began to open as the Death Eater bowed flamboyantly. Werewolf? Cecilia thought hurriedly. Hadn't Snape told her they didn't exist? Don't think, she told herself again. They are plundering your mind for weapons to use against you. As she turned to face the ice gaze of Voldemort again, her fight to eradicate her thoughts was overpowered by the muttering of 30 very powerful dark wizards. She turned back and stared bolder at Voldemort, the potion gripped tighter in her hand. The trick was to make him angry, enough that he would kill her.